The growth of the Jewish Yishuv, or proto-state, in Israel will be our second part of our sixth installment of our crash course in Jewish history. In the 1900s, we'll bring about the advent of the second Aliyah. This was another influx, this time of 30,000 souls, mostly from Eastern Europe, mostly a result of the pogroms going on in Europe. This will see the birth of the first Jewish city, because until then, the coastal port was Jaffa. That's where most of the Jews were coming through in their Aliyah, and they're coming to Israel. And right next to Jaffa, they will establish Tel Aviv, which means spring hill, an expression taken from the book of Ezekiel. And here you see it was a sand dune with a few dozen families. And just a number of years later, we already see the growth of a city. That in 2 years they achieved that much building, but it was shortly thereafter. Tel Aviv grew by leaps and bounds. And this Aliyah will see the first founding of more urban areas, because until then, a strong drive of the Zionist movement will be the agricultural element. This came from several areas. First of all, just the need to subsist, to have food, and the practical considerations. But there was also an ideological considerations. Many of the early Zionists were socialists, and there was a feeling, a belief of the Jew needing to re-engage with the land, to re-engage with their physicality, to have those professions which had been denied to us, of being a farmer and of working the land. From a religious outlook, and especially in the Aliyah Aleph, many of the Olim were religious, there was a religious impetus to engage in the land, to work the land, and to fulfill the commandments that are connected to the land, of taking tithes, of how to grow plants, and that drive was there as well. Now, as these new farms, yeshuvim, which means settlements, although that word today has taken on a very political tone, there was also a need for self-defense, because there were marauding groups of Arabs who would simply attack the Jews. There was also a dynamic where the local farm owners, the local landowners, had very cheap labor in Arab filahim that they paid subsistence wages. With the coming in of Jewish farms, the prosperity rose. They had more modern techniques of agriculture. There was a foreign infusion of money, which also brought the standards up. And the local landowners were afraid that their workers would start to demand more wages. Now, in the Jewish farms, there was a debate of whether to use only Jewish labor or to hire Arabs as well. And both things were done. And so there was an animosity from the part of the Arab landowners towards the Jewish farms as well. Here you see the first founding of Kibbutz Degania, and the first kibbutz in 1910 on the banks of the Kinneret. And the danger to these first pioneers will be met with a response. And the two figures who were behind that movement of self-defense were Joseph Trumpeldor and Zev Jabotinsky. Now, Trumpeldor was a Jewish veteran of the Russian-Japanese War. He lost an arm in the war. He was a big man, a brave fighter, and he organized groups of Jews to defend themselves. Jeb Jabotinsky, on the other hand, was a writer, a journalist, and a poet, an intellectual. And he covered the Kishinev massacres. And like Herzl, he had a sudden awakening. He had a realization that if Jews did not stand up for themselves, no one would. And so he started writing. He developed the concept of Hadar, of Jewish glory, Jewish strength, and also the idea of self-defense. He formed the Beitar movement, which was Brit Trumpeldor. Joseph Trumpeldor was killed in 1920, defending one of the Jewish farms in the north called Tel Hai. And Jabotinsky took inspiration from him. He eventually will start what is called the revisionist Zionist movement, because he felt that the mainstream Zionists, led by David Ben-Gurion, who became the first prime minister of Israel, he felt they were too accommodating with the British. They were too passive. They didn't advocate Jews defending themselves enough and relied too much on the British. And we'll talk about how that will unfold over the next 30 years. Part of the push for Jewish self-defense came with the advent of World War I. And Trumpeldor pushed for Jews to serve in World War I against the Axis, which was composed of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And it's very clear that they sided with the British rather than the Ottoman Empire. Perhaps they felt that under the British, there would be more chance of the Jewish presence to grow. And so he formed the Zion Corps. Now, they wouldn't let them fight, so they were assigned to be the Zion Mule Corps to bring transportation to the lines. And they saw action in Gallipoli, the Italian battle against the Allies against the Axis, and they served very valiantly, and that service was recognized. However, Jabotinsky was against this. He felt it wasn't worthy of Jews to be relegated to a secondary task. He held out for Jews fighting, and eventually, at the end of the war, the Jewish Legion was formed. Here you see a Yiddish poster. Here, Alt Neuland, in the Old New Land, meaning Israel. And then below left, you say a Yiddish regiment. And Jews from all over the world actually came to serve in this. Jabotinsky, in his memoirs, writes about being briefly in battle along the border of Israel and Jordan, and his trepidation at being in battle, which was short-lived, because then he wrote about his boredom, sitting on the border, doing guard duty and not seeing any action. But this was the advent of a Jewish movement towards self-defense. And here's the emblem of the Jewish Legion, the menorah, and you see a picture of them by the Kotel, by the Western Wall in 1919. And also very significant will be that this Jewish Legion were kept on by the British, who now had rule over Israel. They were kept on by the British to serve as policemen and keep the order in their newly found mandate. And we'll talk about what is the British mandate in Palestine. So even before the British victory over the Turks, the Allies were talking about carving up the Ottoman Empire. And there was a secret agreement called the Pikes-Picot Agreement, where Britain and France would divvy up the Middle East. They started to talk about it in more concrete terms with the defeat of the Turkish and the end of World War I. And right around that time, the British government released a declaration put out by Balfour, the foreign secretary, where they called with favor for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in the land. And they say that there has to be no prejudice against the religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities as well. Now, the language was purposefully vague. They didn't talk about a state, they talked about a national home. They didn't exactly say what should be with the non-Jewish populations. But this was an incredible breakthrough. And how did it come about that the British would be endorsing a Jewish national home in their new protectorate? So we have to look at the background. The background already started hundreds of years before with what we will call Christian Zionists, or what was known as Restorationism. The Restorationist movement was the belief that in Christianity, for Jesus' second coming, if Jews were in the land, it could precipitate that event. And so already in the 1600s, you had the first president of Harvard calling for the destruction of the Ottoman Empire to make way for the Jews' return. Unfortunately, Harvard has taken a different turn since their first president. In 1844, you had at NYU a professor of Hebrew literature who wrote a book called The Dry Bones in the Land of Israel, calling for the return of Jews to the land. The name of that professor was none other than George Bush. Yes, the great-great-grandfather of George Bush, the President of the United States. And in England, you also had restorationists. You also had Christians who believed and pushed for the return of Jews to their land. Now, there were other Jewish political forces at work, particularly in the figure of Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann who later became the first president of the State of Israel, was a scientist and a chemist, and he came out with a breakthrough discovery which would help with the development of dynamite and explosives, which changed the game for the British war effort in World War I. And because of his recognition and his political connections, he lobbied for a Jewish state as well. Now, the third factor was that the British hoped to have Jewish allies in other areas of the Middle East. Remember, there were Jewish populations in Iran, what is today Iran, Iraq, North Africa, and they hoped for Jewish alliance in that way as well. Now, at the talks after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, a major player was Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States. And on that side, there were also multifaceted factors playing into the push for a recognition of the Jews' place in the land of Israel. Louis Brandeis, who would a few years later become the first Jewish Chief Justice of the United States, Supreme Court Justice of the United States, he at Harvard, interestingly enough, had an awakening of his Jewish identity and of his passion for Zionism. So he lobbied the president, as did Robert Morgenthau, who was the US ambassador to Turkey, and who helped protect the Jews of Israel during World War I. Many of them were displaced by the Turks, and the two of them aroused Woodrow Wilson's restorationist feelings, for he was also a believing Christian. And when he advocated, endorsed the Balfour Declaration, because he was against British colonialism. So the idea of a mandate, what was called the British Mandate, a mandate to hold the land until it would be given over to the indigenous populations, was very favorable to him. But his religious sentiment played in as well, for he said, to think that I, the son of a parson, his father apparently played a role in the church, should be able to help restore the Holy Land to its people. And so with all of these factors converging, the public statement was made, the Jews would have a place in British Mandate Palestine. And for many Jews, they thought this was the advent of the Messianic era. There was great excitement over it. And remember, there was also already a community of some 20 to 20,000 Jews, 20 to 30,000, who had started to build the infrastructure for a proto-state, as we called it. And so the significance of this step cannot be overstated. Even more significant was that 4 years later, the League of Nations was established, which is the precursor to the United Nations. And all of the rulings of the League of Nations were transferred over to the United Nations. And in 1920, when the San Remo Conference ratified the Balfour Declaration, recognizing the right of a Jewish presence and Jewish political presence in the area of the British Mandate. Now, the area was called Transjordan because, as you see in the map, it goes across the Jordan River, which is between the beige and the brown. Transjordan was what is today Israel and Jordan. Now, what started to happen as early as 1922 was a British backtracking on the Balfour Declaration, partially because of the Arab objection to it, partially because of the rise of the importance of oil, and this cannot be emphasized enough. The growth of the automobile was happening, the internal combustion engine, and the discovery of oil happened right around that time in the Middle East, and the British realized the importance of it. And so in 1922, Winston Churchill, obviously an important figure later on, broke off 4/5 of the British Mandate, which would have been covered by the Balfour Declaration, and created a separate territory of Transjordan. They gave this territory to King Abdullah, who was from the Hashemite clan, and the kings of Saudi Arabia would also be from the Hashemite clan, and were also being given territory. There had been an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Turks are not Arabs, led by T.E. Lawrence, and they were also given the rulership of Saudi Arabia. Now, King Abdullah is the grandfather of King Hussein, who is now in Jordan. And some people say that, in fact, Jordan is the true Palestinian state, because these were local populations who are now being ruled over by a king who is not from the local population. So that step was taken, and that meant that the territory that remained was the territory that we would recognize today as Israel. Now, another important figure that we need to talk about in the growth of the Yishuv was Rabbi Avram Yitzhak Kook. Rav Kook started out as a young prodigy student in Europe, in Eastern Europe. He studied at the Slobodka Yeshiva. He was a brilliant mind and a creative mind. He came from the Lithuanian yeshivish tradition, yet you see his shrine, his Hasidic garb. He also is terribly drawn towards mystical teachings, and his writings are inspired writings about the soul of the Jewish people, about the sanctity of the land, about the light of the Almighty, which resides in the soul of every Jew. And he was recruited by his father-in-law, the Aderet, who was the rabbi of Jerusalem, to come to Yafo and become the chief rabbi of Yafo in 1903. And Yafo was really the main Jewish settlement main Jewish city besides Jerusalem. And his approach was very unique because the old religious Yishuv, largely drawn, as we said, from the Hasidic and the Vilna Gaon students, they had built up their religious life and were very wary and sometimes antagonistic towards these new political Zionist olim, because they were at best non-religious, if not anti-religious. And so there would be deep divisions between the two groups. Rav Kook sought to bridge those divisions. He reached out to those communities. He would go on traveling tours to the different kibbutzim and just talk to them, engage with them. There's one story of him going for a Shabbat, bringing his own food, and simply saying, I want to spend Shabbat with you. He didn't try to get them to pray. He did his own thing. And because of his charismatic, loving personality, people gathered around him, talked to him, and finally said, teach us something. So he would share some Torah ideas and then got invited back. One of the groups, even afterwards, when he returned a few years later, he was shocked to see a kosher kitchen. And they said, after your visit here, we felt like we wanted to take some steps ourselves. He also, unfortunately, got, in a sense, flack from both sides. The very religious community criticized him for his validation of these non-religious Zionists, because he stated that by giving their lives for the land, they showed their love of the Almighty and their vital part in rebuilding the Jewish people. And he celebrated their re-engagement with the land and saw their physical engagement as a fulfillment of all aspects of the Jewish people in the land. Rav Kook's impact will be felt even after his life, after he passed away in the 1930s, through his son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, because after the 1967 war, when Israel retook the Yehuda and Shomron, what they call the West Bank, and Gaza and the Golan Heights, Rav Kook's son will be the main driving force behind Gush Emunim, what is called the settler movement for Jews to resettle on the entire land of Israel. And as we know, today there are over 500,000, perhaps close to 700,000 Jews who live in these areas. And through his son, he had an enormous impact as well. Now, the Jewish community, the Yishuv was building. You had the third and the fourth Aliyah. The third Aliyah in the 1920s, driven largely by Polish anti-Semitism. We'll see tens of more thousands arriving. And the growth of the Yishuv. The fourth Aliyah, we'll see another, it's at times up to 30,000 Jews a year arriving, till the population was now in the 200,000. And of course, the fifth Aliyah will be those Jews fleeing from Nazi Germany. And in one year, I believe it's 1935, 60,000 Jews arrived, and there was a rapid growth. And the growth happened in all areas, in the economy, of the number of farms, in the creation of political structures, largely driven by the Histadrut, by the workers' unions, once again showing the strong Zionist leanings of the early settlements, of the early Jewish Aliyah. Now, the Arab reaction started to become even more fierce. There were riots in the 1920s, but most dramatically, in 1929, there was a terrible massacre pogrom in Hebron, the oldest Jewish city. There were traditional Jews, mostly very religious Jews who lived there, who by and large got along with their Arab neighbors. And some say it was external populations who came in. 66 men, women, and children were massacred in a brutal way like October 7th. It received world recognition or infamy. And there are many who questioned whether the British really were trying to protect the Jewish populations, which really was their job. After the massacre, they removed the rest of the Jewish population, those who had survived from Hebron, and forcibly brought them to Jerusalem. And the figure behind many of these Arab violence against Jews was Haj Amin al-Husseini. I put IMS, which means Yamach Shemo, may his name be obliterated. Paradoxically, the British had appointed him to be the Mufti of Jerusalem. And it was a grave mistake because he was an extremist. He was against any compromise, against having any Jewish recognized presence in the land, and eventually will lead a revolt against the British as well. He stifled any dissent, and even though there were Arab political figures who might have wanted to find a way to live with the Jews and to accommodate both populations, he either silenced them or at times eliminated them and kept this absolutist position. And see, here you see him meeting with Hitler in 1941. Not much more needs to be said. The fact that he spent the war in Germany and, according to some, organized SS groups of Muslims in Europe to participate in the extermination, in the final solution. Here you see the Yishuv flourishing despite the tensions. Dizengoff Square in the 1930s, there was an influx of German intellectuals, artists, professors, scientists, which helped, of course, the entire Jewish Yishuv. And here you see the white buildings were actually the product of the Bauhaus School of Architects, who started to design as poured concrete started to become a means of construction. They started to experiment with curved surfaces and circular buildings. And of course, the method of construction particularly was well adapted to Israel, where you do not have a lot of wood. And that is the famous white city. The cement was then painted white, and so you have the development of that signature look in Tel Aviv. Now here you see the growth of the Yishuv. By the fifth Aliyah, you'll have 250,000 Jews in Israel, particularly in 1935. You see on the right the graph with the line increasing with the hope that by 1941 there would be 120,000 Jews arriving. And of course, that hope was spurred by the fact that the shadow of the Holocaust started to rise over Europe. Now, as a result of the tension of the violence with the Jews and the Arabs called for a boycott. And the Arab revolt in 1936, the Arabs will revolt against the British, seeking a state of their own, which would have no room for a Jewish state. Here on the left, you see these Arab irregulars, they're called fighters, who turned against the British and against Jews as well, because Jews suffered during these revolts. Jews were killed in Yaffo, in different places in the country. Eventually, it will take the British 3 years, 5,000 Arab deaths, 560 British and Jewish deaths. And these events are documented in a book that recently came out, Palestine 1936 by Oren Kessler. And paradoxically, the Arabs started with a boycott of anything British. And the boycott in the Jaffa port ground things to a halt. And the Jewish leaders saw in this Arab boycott the opportunity for the growth of the Jewish Yishuv. They stepped in, they said, we'll build a port in Tel Aviv where we'll be able to handle all of the freight coming in. And in fact, that's what we did. And that's the Namal that we know today, which is no longer used as a port, but was jump-started it. The British also did not have enough manpower to handle the revolt. And as a result, they recruited Jews, trained them as policemen, and like the Jewish Legion after World War I, created the foundation for a Jewish fighting force, which would be, which was already the Haganah. Now, the British didn't know what the solution would be. And so they formed a Peel Commission. The Peel Commission in 1936 advocated for a partition plan, half the land to go to the Arabs, half to the Jews, or actually more than half to the Arabs. I think it was 60-40 division. The Arabs rejected it and started the revolt, and the suggestion was dropped. We'll see that this partition plan will come up again. But even before that, in 1939, the British Foreign Office issued what was called the infamous White Paper. Remember, we said that the shadow of the Holocaust was hovering over Europe. Jewish refugees were fleeing. My mother was put on in 1938 on a train, a kinder transport at the age of 15, and sent from Austria to England to escape. So Jews were trying to get out wherever they could go. And the White Paper spelled disaster. Here we see that indeed, from a peak of 61,000 fleeing the Nazis in 1935, immigration will be reduced to legally in 1939, after 1939, 15,000 a year, but practically not even that many were given papers by the British to be able to enter. And the culpability of the British cannot be overstated, because had the doors remained open, we don't know how many hundreds of thousands or millions of Jews could have been saved from the Holocaust. And that blood was on the British hands. And maybe the British did accept in 10,000 young children, my mother amongst them. But that doesn't answer up for them closing the gates of Israel, which of course was accommodating or succumbing to the Arab pressure. When, remember, once again, we had a Balfour Declaration, which declared that the mandate was for both the Arab and the Jewish populations. Now we go back to Zev Jabotinsky, who was touring Europe at the time, and he started turning his efforts from getting Jews to come to the land of Israel towards warning them about the Holocaust and trying to tell them the urgency. And he said, I've been imploring you, Jews of Poland, the crown of world Jewry, appealing to you, warning you of the catastrophe that's near. My hair has turned white. I've grown old over this. My heart is bleeding that you do not see the volcano which will soon spew its fires of destruction. Listen to my words, you are at the 12th hour. And somehow intuitively, he knew that this was coming. And so the attitude of the Yishuv, of the Jewish community in Israel, was, we'll fight the Holocaust with the British like there was no White Paper. And in fact, the Jewish Legion was reformed And Jews in World War II saw active battle and fought valiantly for the Allies. But at the same time, they said, we will fight the white paper as if there was no Holocaust. And this is the beginning of the freedom battle for Jews to have our independence, to have the right to our own indigenous homeland as a national and religious people, as an ethnic group. And so they began the Mapilim. Mapilim are the boats which tried to run the British blockade. Here you see the SS Tiger Hill off of Haifa in 1939 running aground, and the local populations, the Jews from the kibbutzim, would crowd onto the beaches so that the new immigrants could run amongst them. The British wouldn't know who was who and wouldn't be able to deport them. And you see another tragedy because they knew that the ports of Israel were closed to Jews. A boat set off the SS St. Louis to Cuba for Jews to find refuge in 1939. They were turned away by Cuba. They sailed to the United States mainland. They were turned away from there and eventually sent back to Europe, not actually to Nazi Germany. That far they didn't go, but the Dutch, French, and British took them in. There were some 2,000 souls on the boat. And obviously the ones who went to France and Holland would be shortly have their lives in peril from the Holocaust. So the world is on the verge of a massive world war. The Jewish Yishuv has grown in strength and in number, and the Jews will be fighting in World War II on the Allies' side. And during the war, the Jewish Yishuv also made efforts to try and save Jews. Everyone was making efforts to try and bring them in, but those efforts were, had the white paper not been issued.